is a kind of pain that doesn't have a clear origin. You carry it. You feel it. But when you trace it back, there's no obvious wound, no betrayal, no moment that broke you. And yet, the heaviness remains. Carl Jung once said that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. But what if it's more than that? What if the pain you feel didn't start with you at all? Maybe you've inherited pain, not just through memories or trauma, but through silence, through tension, through the looks that were never explained, through the quiet ways your parents feared the world, the rules you followed without ever being told, the shame that wasn't yours, but was passed down like an heirloom. We often think suffering is personal, that it's the result of our own choices, our own failures, or circumstances. But many of the wounds we carry come from generations before us, from wars, oppression, abandonment, from entire cultures forced into survival mode, from ancestors who had no room to feel, who had to push pain aside just to keep going. And now, here you are, feeling it all, without knowing why. This is the burden of collective suffering. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, subtle. It seeps in through family dynamics, cultural expectations, and emotional inheritance. You find yourself overreacting to small things. You sabotage love. You isolate when you want connection. You feel a deep sadness you can't explain. And the worst part? You think it's all your fault. But what if you're simply the one who's finally strong enough to feel what generations before you couldn't? What if your anxiety, your fear, your grief isn't weakness, but evidence that the pain is finally being acknowledged? Jung believed that the unconscious is not just individual, it's collective, that we share a psychic inheritance with those who came before us. And until we make that unconscious pain conscious, it controls us. So the question isn't just, why am I like this? The deeper question is, whose pain am I carrying? But collective suffering doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body. Our bodies remember what our minds try to forget. Trauma isn't always a visible wound. It's stored in tension, posture, the breath we hold unconsciously, the tightness in our chest when nothing is wrong. Have you ever felt panic without a reason? Or exhaustion that seems older than you? That's not just psychological. That's ancestral. Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, not just the thoughts we share, but the experiences that echo through time. Fear, shame, abandonment, oppression. These don't belong to any one person. They're encoded into generations, passed silently from mother to daughter, father to son, not through words, but through nervous systems, emotional reactions, and subtle behaviors. Your pain may not have started with you. It may be the echo of a scream your grandmother wasn't allowed to release, the silence your grandfather was forced to carry, the emotional absence passed from parent to child, like an invisible inheritance. You may be carrying a grief that never had a funeral, a rage that was never allowed to burn, a loneliness rooted in a story you've never heard, but feel every day. This is not weakness. This is not your fault. But it is your responsibility. Because once you realize your suffering is part of something larger, you're no longer trapped by it. You can observe it, understand it, soften toward it, and most of all, stop blaming yourself for it. Jung believed healing is not about cutting away the pain. It's about integrating what's been left out. And collective pain is the ultimate exclusion. We feel it, but don't name it. We carry it, but don't claim it. We inherit it, but don't examine it. But what if naming it is the beginning of transformation? Trauma doesn't just leave scars. It builds architecture. It builds how you relate, how you speak, how you love, how you flinch when someone raises their voice, how you check your tone 3 times before disagreeing, how you apologize for taking up space, for needing rest, for simply existing. These aren't random habits. They're echoes of survival. You learned them not in a classroom, but in living rooms filled with tension. In schools where being quiet meant being safe. In families where love had conditions and safety was fragile. And these behaviors become your normal. So normal, in fact, that you don't question them. You just call them personality. But the truth is, they're defense mechanisms wearing masks. You avoid conflict not because you're peaceful, but because you grew up around explosions. You people please not because you're kind, but because it was dangerous not to be liked. You shut down emotionally, not because you lack depth, but because opening up never felt safe. This is how collective trauma lives in the day-to-day, not as horror stories, but as emotional reflexes, inherited instincts, subconscious alarms going off long after the threat is gone. And here's the cost. When we don't know the origin of our reactions, we think they're our identity. We assume we're just too sensitive, or bad at relationships, or emotionally broken. But that's not the truth. The truth is, your nervous system adapted to chaos. And now, it doesn't trust calm. Stillness feels suspicious. Peace feels like a setup. Intimacy feels unsafe, because for too long, closeness meant danger. Carl Jung believed that true healing begins not when we label something as broken, but when we trace it back to its origin. When we realize our patterns aren't personal flaws, but intelligent adaptations to pain. Your overthinking? A strategy. Your numbness? A shield. Your fear of connection? A scar from an injury you didn't cause. You didn't choose the trauma, but now you have a choice. Keep living its pattern, or rewrite the script. Unlearning begins with noticing. Noticing when you shrink yourself in conversations. Noticing when you agree just to avoid conflict. Noticing the voice in your head that says, "Don't make a scene," or "You're too much." That voice, it's not you. It's an echo of someone else's fear, passed down through repetition, generation after generation. Because the pain you carry might have started before you were even born. Studies on intergenerational trauma show that emotional wounds can pass through DNA, through silence, through behavior. The unhealed grief of a parent becomes hypervigilance in the child. The shame of an ancestor becomes self-doubt in the present. What you think is yours might be inherited. Carl Jung said, "It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself." Our psyches aren't blank slates. We inherit more than eye color and bone structure. We inherit emotional maps, wounds, beliefs. And when we aren't aware of this, we live our lives solving puzzles that weren't even ours to begin with. So how do you reclaim your story? You begin by becoming curious. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" ask, "Where did this come from?" Instead of judging your triggers, investigate them. Who taught me to fear closeness? Where did I learn that vulnerability is weakness? Whose silence am I still honoring when I swallow my truth? Awareness creates pause, and in that pause, you get to choose. Do I respond with programming or presence? Because that's what healing really is. It's not becoming someone new. It's unbecoming everything you absorbed out of necessity. You see, the pain you carry may not be your fault, but the healing, that's your responsibility. And this isn't just about you. When you begin to heal, You don't just break the cycle for yourself. You break it for everyone who comes after you. You become a living interruption to a lineage of silence. When you lose your voice, you lose more than just the ability to speak. You lose your boundaries, your needs, your truth. Trauma, especially when inherited, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it silences. You grow up thinking staying quiet is safe, that not asking for too much makes you lovable, that self-erasure is a form of strength. But over time, silence becomes suffocating. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. Tight shoulders, knots in your stomach, insomnia, headaches that come from nowhere. This isn't random. The body is a library, and trauma writes its chapters in flesh and nerve. When we don't speak our pain, the body speaks it for us. That's why healing can't just be mental. It must be embodied. It's not enough to understand where the pain comes from. You have to feel it, breathe through it, shake it out, reclaim your physical space. Because the body is where repression lives, and also where liberation begins. Many people don't realize this. Your voice doesn't just live in your throat. It lives in your chest, your spine, your gut. Your voice is your presence, and reclaiming it means coming back into your body, fully, unapologetically. It means noticing when you hold your breath in conversations, when you shrink in the presence of authority, when you smile to avoid discomfort. Healing looks like small revolutions, saying no without justifying, pausing before reacting, breathing before speaking, letting your truth live in your tone, not just your words. As you reconnect with your voice, you start to shift the legacy. You no longer carry silence like it's sacred. You no longer mistake suppression for peace. You begin to take up space, not in a loud way, but in a rooted one. Because true strength isn't in how much you endure quietly. It's in how boldly you exist, without needing to explain why. Once you begin to recognize the pain that isn't entirely yours, something begins to shift. You realize that the sadness in your chest didn't start with you, that the fear in your gut has a history older than your memory, that the shame you carry like skin on your back may have belonged to someone else first, a parent, a grandparent, a people. You begin to understand. You're not just healing your wounds. You're healing inherited grief, unspoken sorrow, unprocessed rage passed silently through generations. You're giving voice to stories that were buried in silence. You're shedding tears your ancestors weren't allowed to cry. You're screaming truths that got trapped in tight throats long before you were born. This isn't poetic metaphor. This is how trauma works. It echoes. It embeds itself in DNA. It rides in the posture, the breath, the reactions we can't quite explain. Collective suffering isn't theoretical. It's physical. It's cultural. It's relational. It shapes how we love, how we trust, how we hide, how we fight. And unless we bring it into the light, unless we name it, we carry it like it's personal. And here's the quiet tragedy. When the pain becomes too much to face, we run. But we don't call it running. We call it achievement. We call it happiness. We call it living our best life. We chase more pleasure, more status, more beauty, more distraction. We post curated joy. We keep moving so we never have to feel. We stay busy so the silence never catches up. Because in that silence, the truth waits. And the truth whispers what we've tried to forget. That healing hurts. That joy doesn't erase pain. It sits beside it. That peace isn't found in avoidance, but in integration. And so the question becomes, are we really seeking joy, or are we medicating our wounds with noise? Aldous Huxley once warned us, not about pain, but about pleasure, that in the wrong hands, pleasure becomes sedation, that we can be pacified not through oppression, but through endless stimulation, that we might lose our freedom not by force, but by comfort. In the next video, we'll explore this deeper warning, how the pursuit of happiness, if untethered from awareness, becomes a trap, how bliss, if manufactured, becomes a cage, and how the most seductive prisons are the ones that promise paradise. But for now, sit with this. Are you actually healing, or just numbing? Are you finding yourself, or performing someone who feels okay? Because real healing doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like grief. Sometimes it looks like shaking hands, quiet rooms, and breaking generational silence, so that those who come after you won't have to carry what was never theirs to begin with.